So, traditional Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. To understand atheist and agnostic as well as many.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Preston.
We are today celebrating an august assembly.
Yes, and it's our 100th episode. So this
is a big deal for us.
Doubly exciting. On today's episode of
the Holy
Watermelon Podcast.
I feel like we don't sync up because you're not confident we can do it.
Because it mutes you when other people talk, but it's fine. We'll just get the sound guy to put in a better version.
That is an option.
Do you want to introduce our very special guest?
I do. I've had the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Sean Hannan a couple of times as we have both worked at MacEwan University. So Dr. Sean Hannan is a graduate of the University of Alberta, like myself, but he didn't stop there. He went on to study at the University of Chicago in Illinois, where he also worked for a little while. And he has published a couple of books, several chapters and articles, and has also edited a handful of volumes full of other people's work as well. So he's a very trusted authority in the fields that we're going to discuss today.
Nice. Thanks for joining us, Sean.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to take it away with our first question, Preston?
Well, as a religious studies podcast, before we get into the studies part, what can you tell us about your own religious background?
Yeah, I don't have too much to say on that front. I think it's a pretty simple story. I was raised Catholic. I grew up in Vegreville, a small town about an hour east of Edmonton. And I went to Catholic school there, St. Martin's for elementary, and then St. Mary's for junior high and high school. Today, I would say I once described myself as a low wattage Catholic. And the person I was talking to said, "Oh, so you're not Catholic at all?" And I said, "Oh, it's not entirely true. I would say, lapsed Catholic, cultural Catholic." I think phrases like that would probably describe me pretty well.
We had a previous guest to describe themselves as a salad bar Catholic. I like that one. Pick what you like.
But at the same time, if I take a step back and kind of, look at where I wound up, the fact that I devote pretty much my entire life to the academic study of religion and theology probably means that, there's something going on, even if it's beneath the surface of my conscious day-to-day life. So I can't really put it into words. All I can say is, there must have been certain questions and concerns that incepted themselves into my brain probably as a child. And I'm still trying to, I guess, wrestle with them and figure them out on some level. Although, like I say, I tend to see religion and theology more as the objects of my academic study or the fields of intellectual inquiry that I inhabit. One anecdote, if I can quickly share it, from growing up Catholic in Vegreville and going to Catholic school was that, every month, I believe, we had to go to church during like a school day, right? So not like a normal Sunday mass, but like a special one where everyone in the school would go. And Vegreville is a town of about 5,000 people, but there's a lot of churches. And there's a very big Ukrainian Catholic church and a kind of moderately sized Roman Catholic church. And I think to appease the parental groups, we would kind of flip back and forth month to month between the Ukrainian Catholic and the Roman Catholic masses. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church was using the Vatican II Novus Ordo, very updated kind of liturgy and everything. Not a lot of trappings to it. And then the Ukrainian Catholic Church had the full divine liturgy, right? So you get the Pope no matter what, but the actual liturgical and aesthetic elements of the experience are quite different. And as someone who, again, grew up, Roman Catholic, not Ukrainian Catholic, the first time I went to the divine liturgy was kind of a mind-blowing experience. I mean, first of all, just the decoration within the church, the stained glass, the gold, all this other stuff, the altar. But then when it came time for the Eucharist, I'm used to the pretty standard wafer, and the kids aren't encouraged to get involved with the wine, at least in the Roman Catholic Church as I was in growing up. But in the Ukrainian Catholic Church, this old priest comes out in his beautiful vestments, and he's got a goblet full of wine, and then there's some leavened bread, floating in the wine, and he gets this fancy metal spoon, and he's like spooning this into my mouth, and I was just like, I don't know what's going on here, right? It was a shocking experience that I clearly still remember. But I only mention it now because I think that was probably my first exposure to the fact that there are different kinds of Christianity, and they're historically kind of inflected, and even versions that are nominally the same, like Roman Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic, still, in communion with each other and all that good stuff. The histories of those two communities makes, the experience of going to church there so different. So I always think of that now when I'm trying to teach the history of Christianity to students at MacEwan, and I'm trying to get them to pluralize Christianity and talk about Christianities rather than Christianity singular. And, we'll talk not just about Latin versus Slavic, but also, Greek, Syriac, Coptic, all these other groups that are really important to study historically also. So I think, maybe some of those ideas from childhood are still with me today.
Great, thank you. So you are a well-published author and editor. I'm curious, which project was the most painful and why?
If I'm being honest, I would say that it can be challenging to be the editor or co-editor on a volume where different scholars write each chapter, right? And I've done a few of those. I've done one called Augustine and Time. I've done one called Mystical Theology and Platonism in the time of Cusanus. And I've done one called Augustine and Ethics. And the Augustine and Ethics one was tough because I sort of inherited the project from a previous editor. And the previous editor had got about 6 chapters together, and then unfortunately wasn't able to complete the rest of the project. So I sort of inherited those 6 chapters, which had already been written, which meant there were 6 authors who had already done their work, but weren't really close to having their work published, right? Because we were sort of restarting the book from scratch. And then I had to kind of add a bunch of other authors to get up to around the number of, let's say, 20 chapters and therefore 20 authors. So that meant not just doing the work of kind of cold emailing people or reaching out to people I knew through academic networks and conferences to get them to write new chapters, but also keeping the original 6 authors happy, keeping them informed on the progress of the project and making sure they knew that we were doing everything we could to get this done. But if you go from like the beginning of that project before I was even brought in to when it was published, which was just sort of I think it was December of 2023. I mean, we're talking 6 years at least, maybe more.
Wow.
And that's a long time to work on anything. I think it's especially a long time to wait if you're one of these people who wrote a chapter early on. So I just felt that was probably my most challenging project, not so much because it was hard per se, right, in and of itself, but it just almost is like a management problem where you have to kind of organize all these different contributors, but also keep different constituencies happy. And then, not to mention working with the press itself and kind of getting everything across the finish line. I found that to be the most challenging, but ultimately I think the pain was worth it because the volume that resulted, I think, is really good. And Augustine and Ethics is, a pretty broad but important topic. Augustine's a really important figure. A lot of people are interested in his contributions to how we think ethically, or maybe the shortcomings of, some of his own ethical positions from our own vantage point. So being able to put together a volume that brings in people doing, historical work on what Augustine actually thought about ethics, but also modern applications of Augustinian ethical ideas and problems to issues that are of great consequence today. So we have a chapter on eating disorders, for example. We have a chapter on incarceration, right? Stuff like that. So in the end, I actually think it's a good contribution to the literature, the scholarly literature on Augustine out there. And I think it'll, be something that people find value in, but I can't lie, it was very difficult to to inherit that project and get it across the finish line. So it's one of those ones I'm happy to have in my rearview mirror.
The academic pursuit of herding cats, eh?
Something like that.
Publishing
Okay.
books is always a rigmarole. So
Yeah.
I'm sad it took 6 years, but I'm not surprised with that many inputs that it took 6 years.
hmm
So was there one project that you feel was the most rewarding or satisfying?
Yeah. I would say in a way, the one that was the most painful was the most satisfying. But I've already said, my piece on Augustine and ethics. I think, to be honest, some of the work I've been doing more recently, and we can talk more about this project later, but some of the work I've been doing more recently on refugees and migration in the ancient Mediterranean world and how Augustine kind of fits into that, I found more satisfying, because I feel like I have to struggle less to make the case to relevant audiences that this is a compelling issue of interest even for us today in the 21st century. Sometimes that could be tough. I've written a lot on Augustine's philosophy of time, which I find fascinating, but you have to do a lot of legwork, right? Sometimes to convince people that, we should care what this guy who lived 1600 years ago thought about the nature of temporality. I think it's a lot easier when you're working with something like refugees or migrant families and you're comparing those experiences from antiquity to similar experiences in modernity. Similarly, I've done a little bit of work with a group, I think mostly centered out of Penn State, that's organized around the theme of W.E.B. Du Bois and the classics. So it's looking at this great Black thinker, Du Bois, from the late 19th and first half of the 20th century, but really attending to what he said about the ancient world and his own scholarly pursuits in that area. As it turns out, he's interested not just in classics in the sense of like Cicero or Julius Caesar, but also I think ancient Christianity. And more specifically, I think he's interested in ancient African Christianity and the role played by various African thinkers, like Augustine himself, in shaping the future of Christianity. For example, Du Bois really likes this quote from a 19th century scholar of antiquity named Mommsen. And to paraphrase, the quote is something like, "It was in Africa that Christianity became universal." And Du Bois finds that quote very interesting. So it's not just that there's some offshoot of Christianity that's African that he thinks is worthy of further study. It's that the universal version of Christianity that went out and kind of missionized and spread itself all over the world, in some sense was forged through the contribution of Africa and African thinkers broadly construed. And I found that rewarding as well, because again, it's an easier, I think, bridge to build between why we should care about Augustine today and why we should care about Du Bois. Because I think if you go back to Du Bois, even though he's from the previous century, a lot of people still find what he's saying about like race and politics and philosophy in America, those questions that he was asking are still the questions we're asking. And in Du Bois's mind, the questions that some of these ancient African thinkers like Augustine were asking were still relevant to him. So if you can see what I'm getting at there, I think in both the migration project and this Du Bois and Augustine kind of side project, it just, I think, makes a lot more sense why we would care about Augustine in the 21st century if we foreground projects like that.
It's quite the explanation. Thank you.
Can you give our listeners an overview, a quick biography of Augustine as our resident expert?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try. And this is one of those things that could be a slippery slope, because once you ask someone who only ever, thinks about Augustine and related figures to give a brief bio, that can be, it can stop being brief pretty quick. But I'll try to limit myself. The short version is this: Augustine was born in the 4th century CE, so the 300s. I guess you could phrase it as a little over 300 years after the probable date of death of Jesus of Nazareth. So Christianity's kind of already been around for a little while. And he was born in what's now Souk Aras, Algeria, so kind of northeastern inland Algeria, not too far from the Tunisian border. He takes a fairly brief trip across the Mediterranean to the Italian peninsula, lives in Rome and Milan for a little bit, but the vast majority of his life takes place in North Africa, but more specifically, what's now northern Tunisia and northeastern Algeria. And I think that's obviously a pretty important thing to keep in mind. It's a good example of how thinking of Christianity as like a quote unquote European religion is inadequate. Not just because it comes from the Levant or the Near East, but also because there are all these other regions and communities that are involved almost from day one. Augustine is a great example of this as well, because so much of what he wrote goes on to shape medieval Latin Christian thought in Europe, right? So a lot of, in other words, it's not just that there were Christians that were not Europeans, strictly speaking. It's that quote unquote European Christianity is itself taking on ideas that were forged elsewhere, and in many ways kind of reiterating and repeating them rather than necessarily like coming up with their own answers to age-old questions. Now, one of the cool things about Augustine is that he gives us a unique window into his own life and psychology, because he writes this book, which you may have heard of before, called The Confessions. Some people call it one of the first autobiographies. If you read it pretty closely, you find out it's a little bit more than an autobiography, but it has certainly autobiographical elements, right? He's reflecting on good chunks of his own life, tells you about his childhood in Africa, tells you about his up and down relationship with Christianity, right? Kind of spurning his mother's kind of folksy Christianity, getting involved with Manichaeism as a kind of variant, dualistic form of Christianity, turning on Manichaeism, eventually falling under the sway of this bishop Ambrose in Milan, and then becoming a kind of ascetic, hyper-Christian adult convert, if that's the right phraseology for it, and then ultimately returning to Africa, becoming a priest, becoming a bishop, and a pretty influential bishop of a place called Hippo Regius, which is on the coast, again, of what's now Algeria. But if you read the Confessions, I think one of the things that really sticks with you is how affectingly he writes about other people, not just himself, right? He talks a lot about his mother and their kind of long road back to seeing things the same way. Talks a lot about his father, although that's a little bit of a bit more of an oblique or darker episode. He talks about the mother of his child, right? And also the death of his child. He ends up sending the mother of his child away in a way that I think scandalizes, rightfully so, a lot of modern readers. And so what you take away from the Confessions isn't just, wow, it's interesting that this ancient guy writes about his own life in the way that we might think a modern person might reflect on their own life. But you also get the sense that, yeah, we do think of Augustine as a saint, and he's held up to be a saint, but he's not a saint in this kind of heroic sense, like you might think of other ancient saints. Like Augustine himself loves a slightly earlier saint, Anthony the Great, who's a desert monk in Egypt, who's out there, fighting demons in the desert and living almost this like perfect angelic life in the flesh. Augustine is kind of the opposite of that, right? He's a deeply, deeply flawed human being, and kind of the whole point of his life story and sort of his theological, I think, viewpoint is rooted in the flawedness of himself and other human beings. So that's kind of the short version of Augustine, right? African bishop, super influential, lots of big ideas, but also because he wrote about himself, I think he invites the modern reader to kind of identify with him and think, I don't know, he kind of invites you to think your way into his own life and relate it back to your own life.
So what sort of ideas did Augustine talk the big Christian thinkers of his day out of? What we might call heresies today were common that he led Christianity away from.
So to get psyched to talk to you guys this morning, I was listening to a couple episodes. I hope I can mention another podcast without necessarily counting as a paid advertisement. But I don't know if you guys have heard of The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, Peter Adamson. It's good. It's philosophy, not religious studies, so I don't think it's a direct competitor. But it's great because he has a lot of episodes on ancient Christian thinkers, and he kind of treats them as philosophers, right? He doesn't say, well, they're not really philosophers like Plato because they're doing theology or whatever. He's really good on pretty much all the big names from ancient Christian thought, like, your Gregory of Nyssa's and your Basil of Caesarea's and Macrina and so on. He has a number of episodes on Augustine. I was listening to a few of them just as I was walking around this morning to get psyched up. And he mentioned in there this idea that I think he got from one of his grad school professors, that Augustine can be likened to a musician like Miles Davis, someone who riffs on established themes with the originality of an artist. And I really like that. So I wanted to kind of repeat that and also give Adamson a shout out, because the way Adamson talks about this stuff obviously has been formative for me as well. So I kind of see Augustine as inheriting a lot of ideas that are kind of already out there. And you could say debates that are already out there, right? What is sin, really? To what degree does God do the work necessary to save us from sin? To what degree do we freely choose to live a virtuous life? And if so, does that play a role in liberating ourselves from sin? What role do rituals and sacraments specifically play in all this? What should our relationship to our own bodies be? And then again, I've mentioned this theme of universalism and universality a couple times, but how universal is the body of Christ in the sense of the church, right? Are we thinking of like a small thing, a remnant of true believers? Or are we thinking of a big, unwieldy institutional thing that includes lots of different communities and viewpoints, albeit imperfectly and with tensions that will seemingly continue? Now, in terms of groups that Augustine is arguing against, he's a very polemical thinker. That's probably something else that should be stated about him right off the bat. A lot of his ideas, not all of them, but a lot of them are articulated in polemical debate with other groups, right? At first, that's the Manichaeans. Short version of Manichaeans is there was a 3rd century prophet in Persia named Mani, and he called himself sort of an apostle of Jesus. So in a sense, he saw himself as a Christian, but his mode of articulating Christianity was very influenced by Zoroastrian dualism, right? Zoroastrianism being one of the sort of indigenous religions of Persia. And what we mean by dualism here is just that good is good and evil is evil, right? In the beginning, there was goodness and there was evil. There was light and there was darkness. Everything was fine. Everything was in its proper place. At some point, the forces of evil invaded the forces of goodness. Our world resulted from that cosmic war, and we live kind of in the battleground between light and darkness. And that's why sometimes we're pulled down towards evil. Sometimes we're pulled up towards good. At the end of the day, light should go back to being light and darkness should go back to being darkness. Jesus is the pivot point in that cosmic battle. He comes to represent the kingdom of light and the father of lights, and he's going to bring us all back to light, or at least bring some of us. That means, at least in the interpretation of someone like Augustine, that maybe we're not always guilty of our own sinfulness, but rather they're like particles of evil, kind of literally particles of evil that are in us, in our bodies, that cause us to be evil. And if we could kind of purge that through asceticism, maybe through the cycles of reincarnation, all this stuff is on the table for Manichaeism, then we would be free because we'd have sort of decontaminated ourselves of sin particles. Ultimately, Augustine comes to reject that. And so his sense of sin as a kind of condition that we inherit from Adam and that affects our souls just as much as our bodies, right? Your body doesn't necessarily make you do bad things. It's, your soul, your psychology kind of plays the main role there. He's going to say that the Manichaeans basically are just wrong about dualism. They're wrong about sin. And so you have to kind of take on this idea of original sin that, yes, you inherited, but also you're kind of responsible for. And you can no longer blame your body or, the particles of darkness or whatever you want to call it. Another group he argues with are the Donatists. And I was kind of hinting at them when I talked about this idea of the church as like a small, pure remnant, right? They were pretty skeptical of other Christians around the Mediterranean world and beyond because there had been so many persecutions of Christians, going, especially in 250 with the persecution under the Emperor Decius, and then the early 4th century Diocletian's great persecution. A lot of people handed over the scriptures to be burnt, or they sacrificed to the good health of the emperor. They did things that the Donatists thought were beyond the pale so that they could stay alive. And then they would often repent. And then the question sort of became, well, should they be let back in or not? And what about, like, say, a priest or bishop who handed the scriptures over to be burnt by the Roman authorities? If that priest later, after repenting, baptizes someone or ordains another priest, do their sacraments work? Are their sacraments efficacious? Some would say, some members of the Donatist party would say no, right? Because they've sort of sullied themselves to such a degree that they've lost kind of the spiritual authority to perform the sacraments efficaciously. And Augustine ends up pushing it back against that too, right? And that has consequences, all sorts of kinds. One is, baptisms are basically going to be efficacious no matter what, even if it turns out that the priest was secretly evil all along. And it also means that this idea of the church as a big, unwieldy body that is in principle universal and will include a lot of imperfect, flawed, and maybe just downright bad people. The idea of the visible church, including all of that within its kind of institutional scope, is going to be what Augustine argues for within Africa. And ultimately that is, kind of what takes hold and what connects his African Christianity to European Christianity or other Christianities around the Mediterranean world. Lastly, real quick, his other big opponents are the so-called Pelagians. Basically, this monk Pelagius comes down from somewhere in the British Isles during Augustine's lifetime. He winds up in the Mediterranean and is kind of a life coach, kind of inspirational preacher figure. And he really wants to emphasize how you can kind of pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. You do have the power to freely choose to convert and to start living virtuously and to put away your vices. It doesn't mean God isn't going to help you. Doesn't mean God hasn't kind of set up a system, that you can kind of be part of. He's not trying to erase God, in other words, from redemption and salvation, but he really is into this idea that, the human can kind of kickstart the process through freedom and virtuous action. And Augustine thinks that this message, albeit popular, goes too far, and it erases the centrality and the primacy of what Augustine would call grace, right? Which we could just call divine agency. Right, the role played by the divine in turning people around when they convert, right? So it's not that you choose one day to turn around and you just kind of will yourself into it using willpower. It's that, this is sort of a divine gift from the beginning. And that goes for conversion, and it goes for what Augustine would call perseverance, which is kind of the ongoing, sustained ability to live at least less evilly than you would otherwise, even if you're always going to be sort of flawed and imperfect until you die. And so it's those later writings against the Pelagians that lead Augustine to really emphasize grace and, yes, ultimately predestination, which he finds in the letters of Paul in a way that is going to be controversial all the way down till today and will be a big deal in, for example, the Reformation 1,000 years after Augustine, when you can look at Catholic cardinals on the one hand and figures like Luther and Calvin on the other. They're all reading Augustine and they all think Augustine is right. Nobody will say Augustine is wrong. They'll all say he's right, but my opponent is misreading Augustine, right? And that's a nice reminder as well of the centrality of this African figure, that even during a sort of an intra-European Christian squabble like the Reformation, they're going back explicitly to this Augustine guy to try to get to the bottom of this issue of free will and grace.
That's pretty great. Thank you.
I was going to say that was a great summation.
So can you tell us a little bit about your PhD dissertation and about the process around that whole academic experience?
Yeah, for sure. I'll try to keep myself brief on the dissertation because, again, I'm not sure how deeply interested folks will be in this. But what really gripped me when I was reading the Confessions for the first time was kind of the twist ending, right? So he gives you about 9 books of autobiography, roughly speaking. And then he doesn't stop, right? There's a 10th, 11th, a 12th, and a 13th book also. Book 10 is kind of about memory. It's like, he's been using his memory to think about his own past and tell us a story about it. And then he pauses and is like, well, wait, what even is memory? How does memory work? How am I able to remember these things? Can I trust my own memories? Is memory always good? Does memory itself cause occasion for sin sometimes? Stuff like that. Then in book 11, he's like, and by the way, what even is time? Because I'm trying to narrate my life across time using my memory, but I don't really know what time itself is. And isn't it kind of weird that we live in time? Also, it kind of seems like I'm supposed to think that God doesn't live in time because he's eternal. Let's figure out what that means, right? How can a being that lives in time relate to a God that is beyond time? And then books 12 and 13 kind of carry on the theme of book 11 by way of an interpretation of Genesis 1. Augustine loves going back to like literally just the beginning of the first chapter of Genesis, and really digging deep into something that we might read and kind of skip over, like in the beginning God created heaven and the earth. Augustine will stop at the word beginning and say, what does that mean? Right? What is beginning? Does time have a beginning? Kind of seems like that's what this says, but if we say that there was a first moment of time when God created the universe, wouldn't we then have to say that there was a moment before that, like a moment before the Big Bang, to translate it into our modern scientific language? And it leads him to all these paradoxes and things like that. Now, I thought this was fascinating, and this is basically what my dissertation research was on. And so the 2 big things I kind of zoomed in on for my dissertation research, and then this ended up kind of turning into my first book, which is called On Time, Change, History, and Conversion. The 2 things I zeroed in on are as follows. One is that Augustine is very skeptical about the existence of a present moment. And that makes him different than some ancient thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and other Stoic thinkers. Marcus in the Meditations talks a lot about how the present is kind of the only thing that exists because the past is gone and the future isn't here yet. And so it's kind of supposed to give you this almost mindfulness quality, right? If you just dwell in the present and focus on the now and don't worry about the past or the future, you'll attain a kind of mental stability and almost like a therapeutic healthiness of mind. And I think Augustine's the opposite of that. I think for Augustine, there is no real safety of the present moment, and time is always kind of slipping through our fingers like sand in the hourglass. And we can never really catch up to where we are. And so that's why memory is so important to him. That's why, as I talk about in the dissertation in the book, this theme of belatedness emerges. And by that keyword, all I mean is Augustine always feels like we're running late for our own lives. And he uses words related to lateness a lot. And it's like we can never catch up to where we are. And so it's kind of the opposite of that mindfulness movement, dwell in the moment thing that I think is still pretty popular today, to be honest. So I kind of use Augustine as a wedge to push back against that kind of thinking. The other issue I tackle in the dissertation / book is whether Augustine has a subjective or an objective theory of time. All I mean by that is some passage of Augustine could be read as saying that he makes time a product of the soul, the psyche, the human subject, whatever you want to call it. In other words, we kind of create time by thinking of it. And there are modern analogs to that too, right? Different ideas, you might see like a pop science article that says, physicists prove that time is an illusion and we just kind of make it up. And maybe that's true. I don't think Augustine is a subjectivist about time. I think he actually does have what I would call an objective theory of time. And the reason goes back to Genesis 1. In Confessions 11, and also in other books like De Genesi ad Litteram, which could be translated the literal meaning of Genesis, something like that, he's very clear that time begins with the creation of the universe. And humans are not created at the very beginning of the creation of the universe. Therefore, time is already there, right? As soon as God makes heaven and earth, as soon as the Big Bang, whatever you want to think of, there is time. Humans are then made in time, right? Therefore, we are kind of, we are subject to time rather than us subjectively creating time. And so that opens up, I think, a new way of thinking about Augustine that makes him less of a kind of, psychological thinker who's only interested in the way that we construct time for ourselves. He also makes us kind of subject to time as a natural force that is observable in the objective cosmos itself. I think that's actually a much richer reading of Augustine. As for the process, it was pretty good. As you mentioned, I did my PhD at the University of Chicago in the Divinity School, which is a cool place. It's very interdisciplinary. So you're not always being asked like, oh, are you doing philosophy? Are you doing history? Are you doing theology? You can kind of be doing all of them at once. And I had a very supportive doctoral advisor, Dr. Wilhelmine Otten. And, I couldn't have done any of that work without her ongoing support. She helped me get into grad school in the first place. So I'm mostly indebted to her, and I'm sure I incorporated a lot of her ways of thinking as well. The process itself was probably most challenging in the middle. I've actually found that Chicago is pretty chill about the end of the dissertation. It's not like some other schools where they like build the defense up into this crazy, stressful, scary thing. For us, we had the midpoint review, which was like when you're about halfway through, you'd written half your chapters, you had to go in and kind of defend what you'd written thus far. And that was the scary part for me, because, when you're halfway through figuring something out or halfway through writing something, it can be, you can feel a lot more vulnerable, I would say, than if you've gotten all the way to the end and kind of figured out your destination in full. So I would say that was the biggest hurdle to get over, was that midpoint review. And I did, I got some tough questions from my committee, but ultimately I think I was able to incorporate their critiques both into the chapters I had already written and then also into the chapters that I still had to write. And so I think the end result was stronger for having gone through that process.
So Christian mysticism is what I think, a really broad and fascinating field. Often leans into heresy or heretical ideas sometimes. What can you tell us about your studies in those fields?
Yeah, so that's something I've come to a little bit later, a little bit post-PhD. I dabbled in it a little bit during my doctoral studies, because my aforementioned advisor, Dr. Wilhelmine Otten, has done some work on thinkers that are, adjacent to mysticism, and especially like women authors, visionary women authors of the High Middle Ages. So you have like Hildegard of Bingen, Marguerite Porete, Hadovich. A little bit later, you have like Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp and so on. So for a good, half millennium there's a lot of women authors who are using the idea of visionary authority. That is, we are literally receiving visions from God, or mystical contemplative theology, which is a little different because it doesn't necessarily have to mean you're getting visions from God. It could just mean that you're cultivating a relationship with God in a way that kind of allows you to ascend to unio mystica, or mystical union with God, which usually involves kind of the chipping away at your own sense of self-identity. So there's a lot of big words to use here, but a lot of ideas here like kenosis, self-emptying, just like Jesus emptied himself to become human. Now we must empty ourselves of like our ego in order to become one with God. Self-annihilation is another phrase that's used here. You have to annihilate yourself. That is literally like reduce your ego to nothing, so that only kind of God's mind or God's identity is left, kind of working through you. So I find all these ideas inherently fascinating, and you're right that they can get people in trouble. Although you can walk the line of saying this stuff and not get in trouble. In other words, I would say that to be a mystic is not inherently heretical, but it will draw attention of the authorities. And depending on what happens after that, things could go wrong. So in the case of Marguerite Porete, very sadly, she was burnt at the stake, right? She wrote her own book in Old French, in the vernacular, and would like read passages of it to people in public. And I think that kind of brazen approach got her in trouble more than the actual ideas in the text, which were, again, kind of mind-bending, because it was all about self-annihilation and chipping away at your ego so that only God is left. But I would say what landed her in most hot water was kind of the context, right? And probably the gender politics. Someone who I've worked on in greater detail, Meister Eckhart, just, roughly contemporary to Marguerite, almost sounds like Marguerite at times. And some people have said that he knew of Marguerite's work and was influenced by it, and that's possible. He got in a little bit of trouble at the end of his life, but died before he could get in bigger trouble. But he would be the example of someone who is able to use his position as a leader and a scholastic thinker within the Dominican order to kind of preserve his way of thinking, right? Without immediately getting burnt at the stake. Catherine of Siena, also from the 14th century, a little bit later than these other two thinkers, is an example of a woman who comes out of the Dominican community as well, and is taken seriously, and is able to kind of tell the popes what to do. For example, you have during this period the Avignon papacy, where the popes, aka the bishops of Rome, have left Rome, and they're now in Avignon, and they tend to speak French as their vernacular first language, not some Italian dialect. And a lot of people have issues with this, including Catherine, despite the fact that she herself is Italian. And she, at least according to one account, goes to the papal palace in Avignon and just tells the Pope, you've got to go back to Rome, right? Why should you listen to me? Because I've lived this life of mystical sort of death to self, and I've had these kind of spiritual encounters with Christ, right? And Catherine sort of wins that encounter. Later in the 16th century, even the Reformation era, you'll have people like Teresa of Avila, right, who are seen as like defending a certain version of Latin Christianity against what's perceived as the threat of some of the reformers, right? So I think in general, what draws me to mysticism is the ideas, right? This whole idea of like ego death, which sounds like not something you would immediately associate with Christianity, but is very popular amongst these medieval thinkers. But I think there are broader kind of social contextual consequences of these ideas within the medieval world. And it just so happens that gender is really playing a big role, right? And politics in general. So I don't just mean gender politics in the sense of how people were treating women in this period, but someone like Catherine is actually trying to influence political outcomes. Like I say, influencing papal policies and things like that. She also has a lot to say about economics and what's happening with like the emergence of banking and private property and land enclosure and things like that in 14th century Northern Italy. So I think what drew me to bring this now to the book project, which is called Mysticism and Materialism in the Wake of German Idealism, which came out a couple of years ago, and which I wrote with my friend Zeke Goggin. I think what drew us to mysticism there was the kind of political and economic offshoots of these ideas, right? Because a lot's been written about the theology itself or the philosophy itself. What we found interesting was where are the moments where these ideas of overcoming your own self-identity kind of interfaced with political and economic concerns. And I've just given you those examples from Catherine. You'll also see it in Eckhart's sermons, right? He basically will say stuff like, well, if I don't really have a self, right? If my ego is an illusion, then why am I trying so hard to get richer than my neighbor, right? What does it matter if I have 10 marks, the old German currency, and my neighbor has 5, right? It just, once you overcome this sense of self in a kind of philosophical, theological way, then a lot of your other rat race concerns about getting rich or buying up a lot of property start to fade away. So that's what drew us, I think, to mysticism. And then to kind of put that into action, we looked at how in the 19th century, mostly, modern thinkers went back to mystical thinkers and drew upon their ideas in a modern context, right? And in ways, obviously, that interface with political and economic concerns. So it gets a lot more esoteric than that, as you'd probably imagine, but I think that's the best way of thinking of it, right? On one hand, it's this overcoming of selfhood in medieval thinkers that might have political and economic consequences. And then on the other hand, it's the modern reception of those ideas. And kind of, once again, I think you can tell there's an emerging theme in what I'm saying, which is how can we make this stuff relevant? How can we justify the study of it? to my students at MacEwan, to funding bodies that keep this whole thing going. How do we draw those connections? And I think you can do it with mysticism. And if we can do it with mysticism, we can do it with everything, because mysticism is one of the weirdest things out there. So if we can make that concrete and relevant, then it should be no trouble to make Augustine concrete and relevant.
What is it that first attracted you to Augustine?
It was the time stuff. I'm sorry to say. I read when I was undergrad at the University of Alberta, I took a class where we read a book called Time and Narrative by Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher who actually used to teach at the University of Chicago, but long before I was there. And Time and Narrative is a 3-volume, mega tract, so I won't get into the whole thing. But volume 1, which is what I read at the time, super interesting, because it kind of starts with Aristotle and Augustine, and then kind of points out points of overlap, but also points of contrast. And then basically the book ends. And you're like, well, I'm not 100% sure what this Ricoeur guy is going to say ultimately about time and narrative, but it was cool just to learn about these two ancient thinkers and what they said about time, and, whether there was, what the open questions there still were. But a simple way of thinking about it is just that time itself seems to introduce a lot of discontinuity and confusion, at least if we're sticking with my reading of Augustine, where we're not safe and secure in the present moment, but we're kind of sliding down a mountain trying to hold on, but we can't. And then, and then you do stop, but when you stop, you're dead. So, that's basically the only way to freeze time. And it's hard to kind of gather yourself in time, right? When you're sliding down a mountain, it's hard to stop and gather yourself. And what you get a little bit with Ricoeur and his reading of Aristotle's discussion of poetics and rhetoric and things like that is this idea of narrative as the solution to this problem. And basically narrative is what we use in order to make ourselves make sense to ourselves in time, right? So that's what stories kind of do. And so there's this fundamental tension that may never be resolved between time and storytelling, where we keep making these stories about ourselves so that we have a coherent self. You could relate this to the mysticism stuff too, right? Do we have a coherent self? Maybe not, but let's say we want to have a coherent self. Good way to articulate that is to tell a story, to tell your own autobiography and explain how you got to where you are. But then, unfortunately, time keeps happening. So I guess a good example of this would be someone who writes an autobiography when they're 45, and then when they're 50, their life radically changes, or they do something horrible, right? Everyone thought they were awesome when they were 45, then they do something horrible when they're 50, and all of a sudden the autobiography doesn't read the same way anymore. And so time frustrates narrative, right? And our attempts to kind of bring closure and the sense of an ending are always kind of being frustrated by time, at least until we die, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that Ricoeur was interested in. And ultimately he kind of sides with narrative, right? Even if it's imperfect, he's like, well, you got to keep telling stories, right? That's what humans do. That's our best kind of defense against all the confusion that time throws our way. And I didn't really come down on that one way or the other, but what I was more interested in was these ancient sources, and obviously Augustine more so than Aristotle. I kind of just couldn't believe that there was this guy from 1600 years ago saying all these cool paradoxical things about time, let alone that he's a Christian bishop from Africa. So, it seemed like a very curious character. And I decided to kind of just go down the rabbit hole of the time stuff, which I found fascinating, but didn't fully understand and probably still don't. And along the way, kind of got drawn into the wider world of Augustine stuff, right? So learning more about the context, what was going on in Africa. What do we mean by Africa in that time period? All the other debates, right? It wasn't like I started with the problem of free will and predestination, right? I kind of was forced to learn about that along the way, because if I'm working on Augustine, I have to read that stuff. Same thing with Manichaeism. I wasn't really puzzled about whether there's an ultimate principle of evil that's at war with an ultimate principle of good, but I had to learn about that along the way. Same thing with the Donatists, right? I had never really thought that much about whether baptisms only work if the priest is a good guy or not, but I had to learn about that as part of the Augustine thing. So it really did start with the time stuff, esoteric though that may sound, and from there, I think one of the cool things about studying Augustine is that he, like Nicholas of Cusa, is a node between all these different histories and lineages and ways of thinking. So if you learn about Augustine a little bit because you're interested in one topic, you'll probably just be forced to learn a little bit about Augustine on all these other topics, which is great, because then if you find yourself at a conference and you're having dinner with people who work on like Calvin, there's a little bit of room for conversation there, right? Or if you find yourself at an ancient Christianity conference talking to people who work on Gnosticism, you can use the Augustine and Manichaeism connection to talk to them. So that's, again, another cool thing about studying Augustine is it just kind of puts you into contact with all of these other conversations, ancient, medieval, and modern.
Cool. So when we first met, this goes back a little bit, I reached out to you about your class on humanism, where you focused a lot more modern literature. So I'm curious, how does your work with Augustine affect your approach to the more modern classics like Frankenstein?
Yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah, so we teach this course at MacEwan, Humanities 101, aka Humanism. Kind of a broad title, so who knows what that means. The way I like to describe it to the students is we're going to read 5 books. We're going to read, these texts in their entirety. It's not a textbook class. It's like you're reading actual books class. That's kind of the main point of it. But as you read these 5 texts by Aeschylus, Plato, Ibn Tufayl, Rousseau, and then finally Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I want you to ask yourself, what does it mean to be human in the world of this text? And as you're thinking about how the text sort of answers that question, I think you will notice that 9 times out of 10, the human is being defined in relationship to the rest of nature, and usually through like animals, sometimes plants, but usually animals. What do we share with animals? Well, we both have bodies, stuff like that. But also humans are usually kind of positioned relative to ideas about the divine. And I don't just mean Christianity. It could be, a polytheistic setting as it is for Aeschylus and Plato or whatever. And humans often find themselves kind of sandwiched in between, right? The divine up above, and in some sense, we might share something with them or reflect them in some way or reflect it. And then we also share much with beings that we might position lower than us on sort of this hierarchy. And I'm not saying the hierarchy is right or wrong. I'm just saying you might notice this if you read these texts and you're trying to kind of figure out what they mean by what it means to be human. Now, as we march through these texts, I'm not always bringing up Augustine, right? I'm not really shoehorning him in that way. But I think what you'll find is that, depending on how each author defines the human being, you can kind of put Augustine into conversation with those authors in different ways. So let me use 2 examples. One would be Ibn Tufayl, who's a 12th century Muslim author from Al-Andalus, writes this amazing text called Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, which is kind of the original desert island story, kind of like the Jungle Book too. What if a kid grew up on an island where there are no other humans and he was raised by animals? He had no language or education or religion. What would happen? Spoiler alert, he would develop reason perfectly and he would rationally arrive at the idea of a necessarily existent being and he would worship that being, thereby proving, a kind of philosophical monotheism and a kind of mysticism, because he sort of has like a kind of mystical encounter with this divine being. Ultimately, for Ibn Tufayl, the human is the rational animal, right? We share so much with other animals. We can be raised by other animals. We can love other animals. Hayy ibn Yaqdhan basically has a deer for a mother, and they love each other, and their love is no less true for the fact that they're different species. But the deer still can't reason, right? In this sense of like a higher intellectual sense of positing a necessarily existent being and then reorienting your whole life around the worship of and encounter with that being. I think there's a little bit of that in Augustine too, and the reason for that is that they're both influenced by Greek philosophy and specifically Platonism or Neoplatonism, and they're both part of this broader, I would call, kind of Abrahamic encounter with Neoplatonism that also gives rise to mystics like Meister Eckhart and so on. So in some ways, there's just a family resemblance across Christianity, Islam, and Greek polytheistic culture, where you can actually trace sort of similar ideas as they develop. I think it's a little different once we get to like Shelley's Frankenstein, right? She is interested in pushing back in some ways against this excess of reason, right? She's sort of in that romantic reaction to the Enlightenment context, and she's interested in the emotional dimensions of what makes us human, and also what can go wrong if you, like Victor, think of yourself as a godlike creator who's using reason and science to cut God out of the equation and create life from dead matter. More concretely, though, with Shelley's Frankenstein, you get a lot of Genesis 1 and riffing on those ideas, right? It begins with the epigraph from Milton's Paradise Lost, Adam accusing God, basically saying, did I ask to be created? Like, why did you create me from mud and put me in a garden where a serpent, who is probably Satan, can easily trick me? You know, doesn't the responsibility lie with the creator? And then through her novel, obviously, she's going to explore those ideas with Victor's creature questioning him, right? Why did you create me in this way? Why did you put me in this position to fail? The creature even goes further, kind of like Milton goes further, reading between the lines of Genesis 1 and bringing in the fall of Satan, right? And then the creature starts talking about whether he's like Adam. Well, no, he's not like Adam, because Adam gets forgiven, or at least can get forgiven, as can at least some of his offspring. Satan can't be. There's no, I know that's a separate issue if you want to get into apocatastasis and whether Satan can ultimately be forgiven. Let's just say no, for the sake of this parallel. And so the creature says, no, actually, I'm more like Satan. I'm not even like Adam, because I was created to fall, and I have no hope of redemption. There's no forgiveness for me. And I think those are very Augustinian themes, obviously, too, right? Not just they're both working with Genesis 1, but the idea of, you know, creator-creature relationships, fall into sin, and then the possibility of forgiveness and whether everyone gets forgiven or only some people, right? So I think there are a lot of direct connections there between Augustine and the texts we read in Humanities 101, but I've never been so bold as to actually introduce Augustine into that part of the curriculum yet, because I think that it would be too distracting. I like sticking with the 5 texts we currently have.
But it's on your mind sometimes.
Yes. I actually, to be honest, I don't like, I sort of don't teach Augustine that much. Part of that's just sort of the shape of the curriculum at MacEwan, you know, and there's a lot of ground we have to cover. Another thing is I get a little nervous, right? When something is so close to you. On an emotional level, like it hurts more when someone's like, oh, the confession sucks and is boring. I'm like, oh, whereas if I'm teaching, you know, I'm doing like one day on Thomas Aquinas in like a medieval history class, and they're like, yeah, this scholasticism seems boring to me. And I'm like, oh, I can see that, you know, it does seem kind of boring to me too sometimes. Doesn't hurt my feelings. But, you know, with Augustine stuff, it's a little too close to me, I think, psychologically and emotionally. But then also it could be bad pedagogically when you teach something that you've spent like way too many years of your life digging deep into. Probably the Confessions could be better taught by someone who's only looked at it a couple times. It's just like, hey, let's read this together, undergrads, and let's see what we can make of it. Whereas I would be stopping, you know, every second line and being like, oh, what you don't realize is that there's been, you know, 1,500 years of debate about what he means by this word in Latin, you know, which is true, but is not always the best way to introduce a text like that, I think, to an undergraduate audience. So I'm not saying I never teach Augustine. I'm just saying I approach it carefully, because it can be difficult.
It's distracting when you know so much that you want to share. For sure.
Yeah. And I don't want to say like, oh, I know all these things. I mean, there's more that I don't know, but it's just, yeah, I'm so invested, I guess, in the questions, yeah, about all these different passages in the Confessions that it can make it hard for me to have like a breezy, engaging conversation about it. And you do kind of want that, right? When you're trying to get, you know, maybe someone who's just come into university, it's their first semester, you don't want to drown them in academic-y stuff that only grad students care about, right? They can get to that maybe in their 3rd and 4th year, and then they can decide whether they want to go into grad school or not. But I think for the earlier level stuff, you kind of just want to allow them to keep it a little broader and ask those bigger questions, like we do in Humanities 101. You know, what does it mean to be human in the world of this text? That's a pretty broad thing. But I think it can serve as a nice foundation that you can build on to get to the more specific stuff later on.
So recently you've been working on Augustine's writings on the theology of migration. You mentioned this a little bit earlier. What can you tell us to expect of this project?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something I've been working on way too long. I think I first presented on it at the American Academy of Religion conference in 2016, and somehow it's now 2024. So forget 6 years, we're now going on 8 years. But I've never, just because so much else has gone on in between, I've never just been able to sit down and write a book-length exploration of this theme. And I think it would warrant a book-length exploration. But the basic idea is this. Oh, and I did publish an article in 2021, I think, in the journal Political Theology that gives sort of a hint of where this whole thing would go. And people can Google that if they're interested. But the basic idea is as follows. In the City of God, Augustine's other great masterpiece, but also in other writings, he uses this overriding metaphor, if that's the right term, of peregrinatio, or the peregrinus in Latin. So we could translate those words traditionally as pilgrimage and pilgrim. And that's fine. Those are acceptable meanings of those terms. My problem there is that in addition to like Thanksgiving pilgrims or whatever, which is like a separate thing, there's also this like medieval idea of cultic pilgrimage, which does start in late antiquity, but I wouldn't say it's the core meaning of that word in the 4th and 5th century when Augustine is active. So by cultic pilgrimage, I just mean like shrines and relics and stuff like that, right? We found the bones of St. Stephen the Martyr. We're going to put them in a fancy box. People will come from miles around to look at them. They are pilgrims going on pilgrimage. Something like this was already happening in Augustine's North Africa when he's a child, because he says that his mother, Monica, that was like her main activity as a Christian, aside from just going to church, was to go to the graves of the martyrs and to feed the dead. Basically, like it's like pouring one out, for your fallen comrades, like pour some wine in the grave and have like a feast around the graveyard. And there were all sorts of concerns about whether this was orthodox or not. Basically, when Augustine becomes bishop, he has to kind of accommodate this. I think on some level he's uncomfortable with the cult of the martyrs, but then he realizes that it's just the lifeblood of the church already. So he's got to like find a place for it. And so he comes full circle to what his mom already thought was cool in Christianity. So anyways, that kind of pilgrimage is there. But I don't think that's the core meaning of the Latin term peregrinus that Augustine uses. I think it means something more like exile or refugee or migrant. And I've settled on migrant because I think it captures a bit of refugee, but doesn't, it's a little more expansive. You could be an economic migrant, or you could be a migrant from all sorts of reasons. But you don't have to be a pilgrim in the sense of I'm going to a shrine. And so Augustine kind of broadens this idea of the migrant out to capture everyone, right? He says everyone's a peregrinus. There are actual peregrini, actual migrants, and we don't want to minimize their plight. In fact, we want to pay special attention to supporting them amidst their struggle. But in a sense, we're all migrants in this world. None of us are truly at home in this world, right? And that obviously undercuts your relationship to this worldly patriae, fatherlands, homelands, patriotism, right? Things like that. But also just the sense that you're at home in the world of space and time itself, right? Because we're all going somewhere else in some sense in the long run, right? And so we're all migrants in that way. And so I think it's not like a pilgrim, because a pilgrim leaves their home, goes to a shrine, and goes back to their home. For Augustine, we're kind of born migrants, because he actually, not to get into the weeds again, but he's arguing against a quote unquote Gnostic idea that we pre-exist our bodies, right? And then we're kind of like shunted down into our bodies, and then we pop back out of our bodies at some point. Augustine does not want to concede that. So we kind of are just, our souls and bodies are just kind of like there together as far as we know when we're born and when we're not home. When you're a baby, you're not at home. When you're an adult, you're not at home. You might go home when you die, or you might go to a far worse place, right? But everyone's a migrant, regardless of what our destination might ultimately be. And so I think the experience of like a migrant or a refugee who's like not going home, right? Who's going to live in exile for their entire lives is closer to what Augustine has in mind. Now, the upshot here is that in Augustine's time, especially starting in the second decade of the 5th century, there was a Mediterranean migrant crisis, kind of like some would speak of a Mediterranean migrant crisis today. But the flow was different. Instead of migrants fleeing Africa for Italy, or other parts of Southern Europe, they would flee from Italy to Africa. And this is because this guy Alaric and his Visigothic army sacked Rome in 410 CE, and you have this huge flight of refugees, really, from the Italian peninsula across the Mediterranean into Augustine's North Africa. So not only do you have Augustine having this general metaphor of the migrant that's meant to explain the experience of every human being in some sense, you also have a more focused call for Christians to apply the love of neighbor to these migrants. And that forces Augustine to like take a stand on this idea of like, who is really my neighbor? As you may know, this comes up a lot in the 21st century too, right? Some people would have a very constricted sense of like, well, neighbor is a local term. And so really it's about localism and like bucking up together in like a closed community or something. That's not what Augustine says, right? It's that universalism thing, right? Everybody's your neighbor. How can everyone be my neighbor? Well, sorry, they are, right? So when we talk about love of neighbor, even if it's some guy from Italy who's coming to live on your land in Africa, you've got to be hospitable to them. You have to love them as yourself, right? Love of God and love of neighbor is what it all boils down to. For Augustine, love of neighbor includes love of the migrant. That, I think, is why the migrant becomes the dominant metaphor for him in the last couple decades of his life. And I think there are concrete points of connection with the lived struggles of actual migrants, especially in Augustine's own late antiquity, but also in the book I want to explore, putting Augustine into conversation with modern, what's called theology of migration. It doesn't have to be just theologians or other theorists of migration and human movement, right? So like for theology of migration, there's authors like Peter C. Fan, Ilsep On. For theorists of migration and movement, there's this guy Thomas Nail I find really interesting. So I think there's a whole modern kind of 21st century set of scholars that are doing this kind of work. And so my goal is to get my reading of Augustine's Peregrinus as Migrant into that conversation and say, hey, Augustine can be a resource for us if we're building theories or theologies that like center the migrant, right? Rather than seeing the migrant as some aberration and the kind of sedentary, settled community as the norm. So that's the basic idea. I have, as you can tell, like these ideas have been percolating in my brain for quite a while. Sometimes that can make it harder to, finalize the book proposal and actually send things off. But this summer, I'm trying to really get serious about it again. I'll be going to the Oxford Patristics Conference in early August. It happens only once every 4 years, so it's kind of like a big thing in the study of late antiquity and the church fathers. And I sort of forced myself to return to this topic. So over the next couple weeks, I'm going to be trying to finalize that paper and try to move the ball forward beyond sort of what I've told you thus far. And that will involve a lot of like legwork within the City of God. It's 22 books long. The article I wrote on this topic only focused on book 1 of the City of God. So at least, even if I just keep my book project constrained to the City of God, I still have 21 more books to go through the usages of words like peregrinus and kind of test out my theory that migrant is the better translation relative to pilgrim. So we'll see. I'll see if I can pull it off.
Awesome. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to advertise while we're here?
Or how can people connect with you after this episode?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I should advertise the fact that I'm still on Twitter, but I am, because I've proven, despite all of the reasons to get off, I must be addicted because I can't get off. I still find it kind of useful for connecting with academics internationally and staying on top of conferences. So I can be found on Twitter. Let me double check what my actual profile is. It's just at Sean M. Hannan. So it's SeanMHANNAN. I have an academia.edu page, but that's kind of old these days. I have a Humanities Commons page. You can check out some of my stuff there. That hasn't been updated in a while either. But yeah, I try to post about what I'm doing on Twitter for sure. projects that are upcoming, yeah, like I said, we're going to be doing this UBC medieval workshop that might turn into another volume down the road. And I've also been writing a little bit on the Augustine and Du Bois connection that I mentioned before. So I have a chapter that should go off to an edited volume on Augustine and pluralism. That's being edited by my friend Bolek Kabbalah, and that should be a lot of fascinating and timely chapters in that volume. And then I'm also trying to finalize a chapter on time and eternity in Nicholas of Cusa. Sorry, I'm not sure I can make that super relevant right now, but I'll I have to be allowed to write my esoteric philosophy of time articles too. And that will go into a volume that of collected papers from a conference at St. Andrews in Scotland from last summer. So like I say, I'm trying to keep one foot in the Augustine stream, one foot in the medieval mysticism stream, and keep things going there. But the migrant book will be, if I'm able to pull it off, maybe get a sabbatical or something, which might be the only way I can actually pull this off. I'm hoping over the next couple of years I can get that out there, because I've waited too long already.
I think it's fascinating work.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, our audience knows, but we're going to repeat it anyway. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We've got a Patreon and Spreadshop where you can get Holy Watermelon merch and exclusive content. And of course, Discord is a great place for us to hang out and chat and point out all the things that we don't talk about on the show and ask really great questions. And of course, share wonderful memes.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
I forgot. I was just going through my mental Rolodex for things that I should be plugging. On January 1st of this year, I became editor of a journal called Religious Studies and Theology, which has some Canadian connections and connections to scholars here in Edmonton who've been in charge of the journal in the past. And I just wanted to put a plug out there for any grad students or early career scholars who are looking for places to publish articles that are maybe less, intimidating than some other venues. As editor, I'm happy to answer any questions people may have. So even if you just Google, Religious Studies and Theology Journal, you hopefully will come across the Equinox Press website where we're hosted. I can give you guys a link if you're able to post that link to our submissions portal somewhere. That would be great too. Because I think it's a great journal with a long track record, good pedigree, but also, like I say, you won't get that situation that you'll get with some other journals where it takes 3 years for your paper to even get considered, right? I'm trying to keep things to a pretty quick turnaround time here. So I just wanted to put out a plug for that because I really want us to get some good, strong article submissions from early career scholars, especially. That's kind of my vision for the journal. It doesn't have to be Canadian, right? It's a Canada-based journal, but if you're writing about Nicholas of Cusa's philosophy of time, I'm clearly fine with work like that. So it doesn't have to fit into some sort of narrow box. It's a broad journal, right? Religious studies or theology or both of them together. But it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention that. So I'm happy to answer any more questions people may have. They should reach out to me about that too.
Awesome. That's
we can put
very
that.
cool.
We can put that all in our show notes for you, Sean.
For sure. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Peace be with you.
The late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy